Welcome to our podcast for college Catholics, where we discuss faith and spirituality from a Catholic perspective. I'm Father Patrick. In today's episode, we will continue addressing some topics related to the Fifth Commandment that says, "Thou shalt not kill." Now, in the past episodes, we spoke with Dr. Janet Smith and with Father John of God about questions related to the beginning of life. For example, abortion, in vitro fertilization, technological handling of embryos for research, selective destruction of embryos, the principle of double effect applied to the unintentional death of human embryos, and so forth. Now, in this episode, I will try to address the very delicate question of the end of life questions. I won't be able to address all the possible concerns regarding the end of life issues, but at least I will give a summary of the principles of the Catholic faith, which will help illuminate you in difficult cases, I hope. Now, all this is important because you need to be well informed for when you have to face the prospect of the end of your own life, but also because you might have a loved one or a family member who is terminally ill or is dying and wants to die in peace with God, but is in serious pain, and you might be asked your opinion as to what is licit to do, in other words, what is morally acceptable before God. Now, there are several resources that you can read, and those include, first of all, the Catechism itself, then the compendium of the Catechism, which contains an abbreviated version of the contents of the Catechism in a question and answered format. There is also a document by the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, a document by the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith, responding to some questions and commentaries from 2005, and a document by the National Catholic Bioethics Center. I will put a link to these documents in the show notes below. So let's go to the principles and the development of these questions. One main principle to keep in mind is a principle that Pope Pius XII stated in an address to anesthesiologists in 1957. He said, "Life, health, and all temporal activities are subordinated to spiritual ends." That is, as a general principle, extending one's life and guarding one's health is not an absolute principle. In other words, applying this to a person that is dying, one is not obligated to try to extend the life of the terminally ill person by whatever means possible and at any costs. There are some cases where the spiritual well-being of a person implies to not continue medical treatments that may be of very little use and that might remove the possibility of the person of receiving, for example, the sacraments, or preparing himself well to face death and spending time with his loved ones at the most important moment of his life. So let us look at some clear limits regarding the handling of patients that are nearing the moment of death. First of all, we have to try to provide, of course, emotional and spiritual support to the patients that are in critical condition, or dying, or terminally ill, as well as to their families as far as we can. This implies trying to help the person receive the sacraments and be in peace with God, so that their soul can go to heaven after their death. Now, this is the most important thing we can provide to any dying person, if they are willing and prepared to do so, of course. Another very clear principle is that euthanasia is always a grave moral evil and should not be practiced under any circumstance. The voluntary killing of an innocent person is always gravely evil. So euthanasia consists in putting an end to the life of a person, whether they're handicapped or sick or near death, by an action or by the omission of an action that is required for that person to live. Many times this is done in the name of a misunderstood mercy, hoping to put an end to the suffering of a person. Now, there might be other ways to help the person and ease the suffering significantly through, for example, medication. And even if there aren't effective ways, we are never entitled to murder them. In the case of those who are suffering, they must be helped to understand their suffering and united with the sufferings of Christ. I said that euthanasia is to put an end to the life of a person through an action or an omission of a required action. And this, requires some explanation there. An action, in this case, means something you actually do to purposely cause the death of a patient. An example would be to give an excess of morphine to a patient to the extent that it causes their death. Now, on the opposite side, an omission of a required action implies not providing or administering something that is necessary for that person to live and is easily administered as an ordinary thing. An example would be to stop providing nutrition or hydration through an IV, for example, or to discontinue providing oxygen through a mask or food through the mouth when the patient could easily receive both and they are easily available. Similarly to these things, both suicide or assisted suicide or any voluntary cooperation with the suicidal action of a person, all of these things are grave offenses against God, against oneself, or against our neighbor. In other words, voluntary suicide or assisting someone to commit suicide is a mortal sin, because we are not the owners of our life. God is the Lord of all life. He created us. He created you and continues to maintain you in your being. He is the proper owner of our lives. He is the only one who has the right to give life and to take it back. Now, it is worth clarifying that in some cases, even though the material act of suicide continues to be a grave matter, there are cases where a grave psychological disturbance, like grave fear or serious depression, or an unbearable suffering or torture, can diminish the responsibility for the person's act of suicide, and therefore it might not imply a mortal sin. Another principle is that it is important to know that the use of medication to ease the pain of those who are dying is completely licit, even in those cases where the use of certain pain medications would unintentionally shorten the life of the patient. And you can read this in the Catechism number 2279. In this case, of course, those medications shouldn't be used with the intent of shortening the life of the dying person, but just to help with the pain. In this case, the principle is the principle of double effect that can be applied in this case. We spoke about it in a previous episode. Another important principle is to understand the distinction between what is morally obligatory to do and what is morally optional to do. In other words, to use the terms used by the Magisterium of the Church, there are medical procedures or means that are ordinary. That means they are commonly available and easily provided. While there are other procedures or means, medical means, that are extraordinary, which means they are difficult to obtain, they are not easily available, or they imply excessive physical burden to the patient and are too expensive for the family to afford. When a person is terminally ill, there are certain procedures that we should provide in order to help them stay alive. For example, not to provide basic nutrition and hydration, that is food and water, when it can be provided, would be wrong, and it would be a form of euthanasia. To state it in the words of the Catechism, regarding the ordinary means, the Catechism says, even if death should be imminent, the ordinary care owed to a sick person cannot be legitimately interrupted. the use of painkillers to alleviate the suffering, even at the risk of shortening their days, can be morally acceptable. This is, of course, as long as the death is not intended, but just tolerated as an inevitable, undesired result, of course. Now, what are extraordinary means as far as a dying person goes? Extraordinary means are medical or surgical procedures that are burdensome, dangerous, extraordinary, and disproportionate in comparison with the benefit that they can provide. For example, let's suppose that there's a 95-year-old patient that is dying, and they expect that there's a 50% chances that the patient might live 2 more weeks. In the meantime, they find out that one of the kidneys is malfunctioning. So the doctors have the option to do surgery and perhaps obtain a kidney transplant that would extend the life of the patient for a few more days. However, there's a risk of infection, and there's a risk that the patient might not survive the surgery. So this would be an example of an extraordinary means. Such a surgery would be burdensome and painful both to the patient and the family of the patient, and may obtain, in the best case scenario, only a few more days of life. But at the same time, the risks are very high, and the patient might die in the operating room without the company of their family and their loved ones. In these cases, such means are not obligatory, they are optional. That is, the decision to apply those means or not fall on the prudential decision of the patient and their family, and in some cases, such overzealous medical procedures may even have to be rejected. So here are the words of the Catechism in number 2278. We read, "Discontinuing medical procedures that are burdensome, dangerous, extraordinary, or disproportionate to the expected outcome can be legitimate. It is the refusal of overzealous treatments. Here one does not will to cause death. One's inability to impede it is merely accepted. The decisions should be made by the patient if he is competent and able, or, if not, by those legally entitled to act for the patient, whose reasonable will and legitimate interests must always be respected." Up to there, the Catechism. So I hope that helps clarify all the issues about the end of life, and especially regarding what means we must use and what means we could use and what other means we're not required to use at all. Now, regarding organ donation, the Church allows it as long as it does not endanger the life of the donor. If the death of the donor does not result from the organ donation, and as long as the donor has been completely free and well informed in order to accept that donation freely. In this sense, we should not feel pressured by society to donate our organs if we don't feel completely comfortable. Besides, one has to be very cautious with some signed medical consents that sometimes hospitals require, which are overly broad, and they give hospitals an ample range of choices and do not let the patient make their informed decisions well made. Finally, I want to stress the respect that we owe for the integrity of the bodies of the deceased people. We have to remember that burying the dead has always been the tradition of the Church, and it has always been considered a corporal work of mercy. And the respect for the dead bodies has been encouraged by the Church because of the certainty that one day those same bodies will rise from the dead. There is an inspiring example that you read in the book of Tobit, chapter 2, where Tobit is willing to bury a dead Israelite even though his neighbors ridicule him, and even when he risked being punished by the law of that country. We read in the book of Tobit how he is about to start having dinner with his wife and son, and he says to his son, "Go and bring whatever poor man out of our brethren you might find who is mindful of the Lord, and I will wait for you." But he came back and said, "Father, one of our people has been strangled and thrown into the marketplace." So before I tasted anything, I sprang up and removed the body to a place of shelter until sunset. And when I returned, I washed myself and ate my food in sorrow. And I wept. When the sun had set, I went and dug a grave and buried the body. And my neighbors laughed at me and said, "He is no longer afraid that he will be put to death for doing this. He once ran away, and here he is, burying the dead again." Now there's another passage in the Old Testament that highlights the understanding that it is with our very own body that we will rise from the dead. That is from the book of Job. We read in Job 19:25, "For I know that my Redeemer lives, and at last he will stand upon the earth. And after my skin has been thus destroyed, then from my flesh I shall see God, whom I shall see on my side, and my eyes shall behold, and not another." And then there is also the witness of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. He rose with his own body, so much so that the wounds of the nails and the mark on his side was still visible after his resurrection. Now, however, there are cultures where, because of the lack of belief in the resurrection of the body, they introduced the practice of burning the bodies of the dead. And this became prevalent in recent decades. So the church has allowed the possibility of cremation as long as it does not imply a lack of faith in the resurrection of the dead. And I would dare add that the burial of the dead bodies is still the preferred practice in the Catholic tradition. Now, regarding all this topic of end-of-life issues, there's many more things to clarify, many more questions, which I cannot address all of them here in this episode. So I would encourage you to read those 3 documents I mentioned before. The document of the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, the article written by the National Catholic Bioethics Center, and the document or response by the Dicastery of the Doctrine of the Faith from 2005. Those are 3 documents I would encourage you to read if you want to know more about all this. To finish the episode, I would like to encourage you to have devotion to Saint Joseph, who is the patron of having a good death. That is, he's the saint you want to pray to in order to obtain the grace of dying in the state of grace and being saved. So let us say a prayer, this prayer that we say very frequently, every day actually, in Miles Christi, in honor of Saint Joseph, asking for a good death. O glorious Patriarch Saint Joseph, whose power can render possible even things which are impossible, come to my aid in my present trouble and distress. Take under thy protection the important and difficult affairs which I entrust to thee, that they may end happily. Let us ask him especially to die a holy death. My beloved Father, all my confidence is in thee. Let it not be said that I invoke thee in vain. And since thou art able to obtain everything before Jesus and Mary, show me that thy goodness equals thy power. Amen. May Saint Joseph always protect us and intercede for us. Amen. So that is all for today. Thank you for listening, and please share this episode with your friends. And also, if you can, leave a review in Spotify or Apple Podcast, and also in YouTube. Hope to see you next time. May God bless your day.